Hello friends, and welcome to another online video of Ms. Hoskins' AP Environmental Science. This section is on population and community ecology. Population growth models. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the exponential growth model as it produces what we call a J-curve, describe the logistic growth model as it produces what we call an S-shaped curve, and compare the reproductive strategies and survivorship of different kinds of species, which will help you explain the dynamics of a meta-population. Scientists often use models to help explain how things work and how they can predict how things will occur. But population ecologists use growth models to incorporate density-dependent and density-independent factors and help explain and predict what a population size is going to do. These models are tools for population ecologists, whether we're trying to predict endangered condor birds or we're trying to manage commercial fishing industry, or we're trying to even control pests, whether it be an insect or kudzu. So we're about to look at how these models help us understand and predict population growth. Population growth models are mathematical equations that can occur, and they're used to predict population size at any moment in time. As we saw in the previous experiments with paramecium, a population can initially grow very rapidly, and when its growth is not limited by any sort of scarce resource, it eventually will still plateau out. So we can define population growth rate as the number of offspring in an individual that an individual can reproduce at a given period of time, minus the deaths that are occurring in that individual or its offspring at the same period of time. So under ideal conditions with limited resource availability, every population has a maximum potential population growth rate. That maximum potential is called intrinsic growth rate. We note that as a little r. So when food is abundant, individuals have a tremendous ability to reproduce. For example, domesticated hogs can have litters of 10 little piglets, and the American bullfrog can lay up to 20,000 eggs. And under ideal conditions, the probability of all these individuals surviving to make more piglets and little frogs rapidly increases. But together, a high number of births and a low number of deaths produce a population growth rate that is out of control. So when conditions are less ideal due to some sort of limiting resource, a population's growth rate will be lower than its intrinsic growth rate. Because not every individual is going to survive to reproduce, or some of them just forego breeding entirely. For whatever the reason, deaths do occur. If we know the intrinsic growth rate of a population, if we know little r, then the number of reproductive individuals that are currently in a population, what we call NO, we can estimate the population's future size, NT. And after some period of time, which is little t, has passed, the formula that allows us to estimate the future population is known as what we call the exponential growth model. That is NT equals NO e to the RT, where e is the base of neutral logarithms. That's the e to the x key that's on your calculator, and where the little t is time. All right, so this equation tells us that under ideal conditions, the future size of a population, NT, depends on the current size of the population, NO, the intrinsic growth rate of the population, little r, and the amount of time over which the population can grow. You guessed it, little t. And so when graphed, this exponential growth model produces a J-shaped curve. The J-shaped curve is a representation of the change in growing population over time. So I know that was a mouthful, but here's one way to think about exponential growth. In any population, it is compared to a growth rate of a bank, where the balance of something is R. And then there's always some sort of like interest rate. So like let's say you put $1,000 into a bank and you account for an annual interest rate of 5%. And then after about a year, your new balance should be, do you know how to do that part? Okay, I want to calculate what my new population or my new balance is going to be. Remember that I said initially I put $1,000 into the bank. And then I was going to gain interest. So I was going to gain, how much do you remember? 5%. So e to the 0.05, because that's 5%, times 1 year, gives me NT, when I put that in my calculator, $1,051 and some sort of cents, like 0.27, I think. Okay, let's just say I want to go to year 2. So I'm going to incur a whole nother year of interest. So when I do that, my NT to the 1,051, and I now want to go to year 2. I'm still collecting 0.05 interest. That's times 2. All right. On my second year, I'm going to have $1,105.17. So, if you don't understand the calculations, perhaps that you can understand this. With each year, I'm acquiring a certain amount. And as the next year goes by, it is exponentially greater than it was the year before. As I acquire more money, I can accrue more interest. That's what creates this J-shaped curve. A slightly different growth rate is what we call the logistic growth model, and that describes the populations that experience a sort of carrying capacity. So populations do not typically experience exponential growth rate indefinitely, and they just continue to grow until they like pile up to the atmosphere. They are limited to some sort of resource, and they have some sort of carrying capacity. See, the exponential growth model is an excellent way in starting as a starting point to like understanding how populations grow, but they can't grow exponentially. So the logistic growth model describes a population who's growing initially exponentially, but then eventually slows to what we call a carrying capacity. We notate that as a K. If we're honest with ourselves, the logistic growth model is a more reasonable approach to determining how populations go, because it does incorporate what we would consider as an environmental limit, food, space, something along those lines. So a logistic growth model is a growth model that describes a population whose growth is initially exponential, but then slows to approach some sort of carrying capacity that is a limiting source by the environment. Those models produce an S-shaped curve, and that is the shape of which the model generates once it's graphed. So logistically, a small population can have a very initial small population and experience an exponential growth. And as the population becomes larger, its resources become more scarce, and so the growth rate eventually slows. And eventually the population will reach a size at which the environment can only carry such a certain size of that population. When it reaches carrying capacity, just the growth in the population stops. And so as a result, when you plot this pattern over time, you demonstrate an S-shaped curve. The logistic growth model becomes another model that can show us how populations are experiencing fluctuations. Most of the time, there are two common factors that affect the logistic growth model. We call that overshoot and die-off. So basically, when a population becomes larger than its environment can carry, it has overshot carrying capacity. And so that overshoot causes a rapid decline in the population, as we would call die-off. So I have an example of this, and it's unfortunately in reindeer. A population of St. Paul Island in Alaska is a good example of this overshoot and die-off. All right, here's our Alaskan reindeer. It started off with a small population of 25 individuals that were on this island in about early 1900s. and it grew exponentially until it reached more than 2,000 individuals by the late 1930s. And then after that time period, the population crashed to only 8 animals that were left, mostly because the reindeer ran out of food. I mean, it was an island after all. So this such a die-off can take a population well below its carrying capacity, and so the cycles of reproduction as the population may grow larger again can continue forward. This illustrates a reoccurring cycle of overshoots and die-offs and overshoots and die-offs until a population can no longer oscillate between those two factors. And in many cases, this oscillation of decline and regrowth and decline over time, it usually will eventually reach a carrying capacity. So far, we've considered how populations are limited based on their food and water, and now you've seen one that's limited based on its actual space. Some populations experience this cycle over and over again, and as you can see, the carrying capacity K can be overshot many times, and a die-off, not always down to 8 individuals per se, but can also occur over many seasons, over many breeding seasons and cycles, till eventually the population experiences some sort of K, some sort of carrying capacity. Interesting enough, these oscillations are not always occurred based on size. Sometimes it is attached to another population who's going through this oscillation. It may not always be the one species' fault, like the reindeer that accidentally ended up on this island. Sometimes it just might be tied to another species that is experiencing some sort of stress.